Well, good morning. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Mark chapter 1 to start off. My name is Zach. I'm one of the pastors here at the church. We've been walking through this vision series, excited to continue that with you this morning. But here in just a moment, we're going to look at Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 16. It was July of 1961, and the 38 members of the Green Bay Packer football team had assembled for the first day of training camp. Their previous season had been fantastic. They'd made it all the way to the National Football Championship. Wasn't quite called the Super Bowl just yet. And they lost in a heartbreaker. Very good team. Lombardi was known as one of the best coaches around. The returning team was expected to be even stronger that year. It was almost certain they were going to make the championship again. They were considered the top team in the nation. A group of incredible athletes at the top of their sport, which is what made Coach Vince Lombardi and what he said when he first spoke with them a little bizarre. Coach Lombardi walks up in front of his players and says, "Gentlemen, this is a football." One biographer wrote, "Lombardi took nothing for granted. He started this tradition of starting from scratch, assuming that his players were blank slates who carried over no knowledge from the year before." See, the greatest coaches, they'd never take the basics for granted, even as simple as this is a football. And so that's what we're going to return to today. That's really what this vision series is all about. We're spending a few weeks doing a Lombardi-style return to the basics of what it means to be a church. Last week, Pastor Tom laid out the foundation for us as we are as a church starting with magnifying God. We're using the acronym of MILE, and we talked about what it means to magnify God and how that is our number one priority, our overarching goal as a church. We want to be known for a church that magnifies God, that makes much of Him, that glorifies Him in all that we do. And that is what we want to do, magnify God. This morning we get to the letter I. I know the cat got out of the bag early last week. Many of you were hoping to get that $100 from Pastor Tom, but we decided to split that between the staff. Seeing as how the cat got out of the bag, and you already kind of probably know where we're going. But this morning, we're going to look at this idea of being a church that desires to imitate Christ. Being a church that's known for imitating Christ. You know, if I were to ask 10 different people in our community, in the Soddy Daisy area, and I would have asked them, what is a Christian? I'd likely get maybe 10 different answers. You know, some would say unqualifiedly, yes, I'm a Christian. Some would say, well, what do you mean? I need some definition around it. Some would say, well, yes, I am, but. Or some would say, no, I'm not, but this. And some would say, well, yes, I'm a Christian, but I'm not like those Christians. Or, yes, I am, but I don't think like that, or I don't agree with so-and-so. If someone says they're a Christian and you ask them when they became a Christian, you might get a lot of different answers. Some might refer to a particular moment of when they walked an aisle or prayed a prayer or maybe were baptized or joined a church or, depending on the tradition they grew up in, took a confirmation class. But you'd get a lot, maybe even different answers on when they became a Christian. Others might say they've been a Christian all their lives. They'd say, I was born to Christian parents. I'm not a Muslim, I'm not Jewish, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not an atheist. So I must be a Christian. And there are some, even here in our community, and maybe even some of you, who might say, no, I'm definitely not a Christian. So again, what is a Christian? And you may be expecting me right now at this point to say, hey, let's turn to this chapter, this verse, and look at God's definition for what it means, what a Christian is. Now, here's an interesting fact. Christian was not a term the early followers of Jesus called themselves. It certainly wasn't the name that Jesus gave them. Christian was actually a derogatory term given to followers of Jesus by their critics, by their enemies. We learned this in Acts 11. Acts 11:26 says, and in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. That idea of were called means it was given to them. It was a passive idea. It wasn't a name that they gave themselves. So what did they call themselves? Well, we see that also there in Acts 11. It says they were disciples. That idea of Christian, it actually, when they were called that, it has this idea of little Jesus people. It was meant to be a derogatory term. Now, Think about this. The word Christian appears in our New Testament only 3 times. But the word disciple appears 268 times. This is what the early followers of Jesus were called. This is what the early church, the disciples, the followers of Jesus, what they were called. Now, so is there a difference between being a Christian and being a disciple? Well, it's really, in many ways, semantics. But for many people in the United States, I think that word Christian means that you believe in the basic ideas of Christianity. Maybe you go to church. Maybe you just go to church some, like Easter, Christmas. Maybe you believe in what it means to be a moral person, a person who follows some of the teachings of Christianity. For a lot of people, being a Christian just means you're not Muslim, not atheist, or something like that. I think one of the challenges we face that for a lot of people, being a Christian is more about Jesus following you. Jesus follows you around and kind of gives you a pick-me-up in the morning or before you go to school or work, or Jesus follows you and answers a prayer or two when you need it. And this is a huge problem in the United States. There was a recent Pew study that said nationwide 63% of Americans claim to be Christian. And that's actually down from the previous 15 years where it was at 78%. But 63% of people claim to be Christian. But a number of independent surveys put the number of people who are actually following Jesus, and don't ask me exactly all the specifics of how they measured it, but a number of independent surveys all put the number somewhere between 4 and 8%. 63% check Christian, but under 10 are actually following Jesus. I just want to say, with kindness, that idea is actually very much alien or foreign to the teachings of the New Testament and the early followers of Jesus. And so the question I want to ask you this morning is, are you a disciple of Jesus? Is our church filled with disciples of Jesus? Now, that doesn't mean when someone asks you, hey, what do you believe, that it's wrong if you say I'm a Christian. Absolutely not. That is not what I'm saying. But when it comes to how the early followers of Jesus understood that how they were seen, they called themselves, they believed they were disciples. And I want us to understand what is at the heart of being a disciple. So the real question is, what is a disciple? And are you one? Let me just read a couple passages here. We're going to start in Mark 1, about a few passages about Jesus, then unpack what it means for you and I and how we follow Jesus. Mark 1, starting in verse 16, says, as he, Jesus, passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, Simon's brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Follow me, Jesus told them, and I will make you fish for people. Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat putting their nets in order. Immediately, he called them. They left their father, Zebedee, in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Turn over, Mark chapter 2. Look at verse 13 and 14. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. Then, passing by, he saw Levi, you know him as Matthew, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, follow me. And he got up and followed him. One more. Look over at Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 34. This is a well-known teaching of Jesus. Verse 34 says, calling the crowd along with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? I don't know if you noticed a pattern in those 3 passages we looked at. Just a few passages that highlight the same thing. In story after story, Jesus was not, the call of Jesus was not, believe the right things and go to heaven when you die. The call of Jesus is straightforward. Come, follow me. Another way to translate that, and really the invitation that Jesus gives to his disciples and the invitation that he gives to you and me, is come and be my disciple. The word disciple in Hebrew can also be translated learner, student, or follower. But don't think follower like, oh, I follow you on Instagram, Jesus. I like all your photos. Or don't think student like, well, I go to class on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at Chat State, and I take notes when I can. And just a little bit of a backstory here. Discipleship wasn't invented by Jesus. There were rabbis who had actually preceded Jesus who had disciples, had followers. In fact, discipleship didn't even start in Israel. It started a few hundred years before in Greece. For example, Plato was a disciple of Socrates. Later, it spread across the Mediterranean, and all that to say that the culture, the world that Jesus came into, discipleship was built in to the first century. Sadly, a lot of the time in the church, particularly if you've grown up around the church and you're familiar with that language of discipleship, when we talk about it, it's torn out of its original meaning and context. I know, having grown up and been around church my whole life, one thing I've noticed is that I think the tendency for us is to think of discipleship as making sure people believe the right things. If we have enough classes, enough education, if we teach enough of the right things and people believe the right things, then we've done our job. But that is not the call of Jesus. I mean, I think even back growing up in church, we would have education ministers. And now my role is part-time here at the church is the discipleship pastor. And a lot of times I think when we think about that idea of what that role looks like or what education ministers, their role was, it was like, let's make sure everyone believes the right things. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, we see in Scripture several times of individuals who they knew all the right things about Jesus, but they didn't follow him. Think about Judas. Do you think Judas didn't have all the right answers? Or James even tells us even the demons believe. You could go on and on of examples all through the Bible. The rich young ruler that Jesus meets, Nicodemus, many of the Pharisees, they believed the right things, but they weren't followers of God. So there's got to be something more, and believing the right things is important. Let me stress that. But there's got to be more to discipleship than just knowing the right things. So let's get some context on discipleship in the first century. This is from Pastor John Mark Comer. He said this, Jewish kids started school around 5 years old. And they had the school building they went to was called the local Bet Sefer, which meant the house of the book, which was the equivalent of elementary school. Normally, the Bet Sefer was built onto the side of the synagogue. It was run by a full-time scribe or a teacher. Their curriculum was the Torah. And in an oral culture, by the age of 12 or 13, most kids would have the entire Torah memorized. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy memorized. At that point, the vast majority of students went home. They would apprentice in the family business or help run the farm. But the best, the brightest, they would go on to a second level of education called the Bet Talmud, which meant the house of learning where they would continue their studies. And by the age of 17 or 18, they would have, wait for it, the entire Old Testament memorized. Yeah, I need to improve my education levels here. Now, at this point, the overwhelming majority were done. They were basically told, the students told, go home, start a family, work the family business. That's what they were told to do. Ply your trade. But the best of the best of the best would apply to apprentice under a rabbi. Now, this was really hard to get into. Discipleship programs were the equivalent of the Ivy League today, but even more exclusive. You had to find a rabbi whose yoke you were drawn to. Beg to join his band of students. The rabbi would grill you, how well do you know the Torah? What's your take on the Nephilim in Genesis 6? Do you side with Rabbi Hillel or Rabbi Shammai on Deuteronomy 24? Tell me, how often do you pray? And if he thought you had the smarts, the work ethic, the chutzpah to one day become a rabbi yourself, he would say something like, come, follow me. Or another way, come, be my disciple. Now let's say you're one of the lucky few who gets called and invited to be a disciple to a rabbi. From that day on, your life organized around three goals. Comer continues on here. He says the first goal was to be with your rabbi. You would leave your family, your village, your trade, and you would follow your rabbi 24/7. You were a student, but class wasn't Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 11 to 11:50. Class was life. You would spend every waking moment with your rabbi, sleeping at his side, eating at his table, sitting at his feet, and end up, after long hours, walking behind him from town to town, covered in his dust. That was like an ancient proverb that rabbis, they loved the idea. They wanted to be covered in the dust from the sandals of the rabbi that they were following around so closely. The second goal was to do what your rabbi did. You not only watched what he did, your goal was to eventually do the same things he did. Not unlike an apprentice for a plumber or an electrician who's learning from a master. Your goal is to eventually do the same things that you see your master doing. And finally, your goal was to become like your rabbi. The whole point of discipleship was to train under a rabbi in order to one day become a rabbi yourself. Jesus had this great line about how a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. That's the heart and soul of discipleship. Being with your master for the purpose of becoming like your master. Your goal was to imitate him. You would copy his tone, his voice, his mannerisms, his figures of speech. You wanted to be him. That's what it meant to be a disciple. And church, there's no difference between first century discipleship and today. That is the call to discipleship for us. It is still true for us here at Miles Straight Baptist in 2025. So with that context, what I want to do is I want to spend the rest of our time in one passage. Just answer this question: what is a disciple for you and for me? Look at John chapter 15, verse 8 through 17. John 15, starting in verse 8. And my hope as we look at John chapter 15 is that we would see that understanding this context of what it means to be a disciple will make even more sense for us. So John 15, we're going to spend the rest of our time here. Starting in verse 8, he says this: "My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. This is my command: love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants anymore, because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. I have called you friends because I have made known to you everything I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce fruit, and that your fruit should remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. This is what I command you: love one another." Okay, so from this passage, what is Jesus telling us a disciple is? This is of utmost importance for us. Well, just a few things right here. Number one, a disciple of Jesus has received the love of Jesus. Verse 9, he says, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide, remain in my love." Now, this was unique to Jesus. I mentioned that there were all kinds of other rabbis that were calling disciples. This idea that a disciple has received the love of his master, of his rabbi, was unique to Jesus and his call. Other rabbis didn't talk this way. Their instructions were obey, do. But Jesus' discipleship was first about receiving his love, understanding that you are loved by him. And that's because the whole nature of his discipleship was different from everyone else. Other rabbis looked for the righteous, the accomplished, the best and the brightest, the capable, because these would be the ones they figured who would carry on their legacy, carry on their program of discipleship. So they chose the best of the best. But who did Jesus choose? None of the best of the best. We know, for example, that he chose what occupation? Many of them, maybe up to half, were fishermen. The fact that they were fishermen shows us what? They didn't make it all the way through school. They didn't make it all the way through. They weren't invited by any rabbi to come and follow them. So they were told, go home and work the family business. The fact that these guys were fishermen means they had not made the cut. And I want us to let this sink in. When Jesus selected a squad to build his movement, he intentionally did not choose the A team. He may not even chose the B team or the C team. He started with people that had been cut. He said, this is how I'm going to build my movement. This is how I'm going to start the church. And I've always wrestled with the fact that Jesus would choose these men. He would walk up to them on the sea, and they would just drop everything and go with him. Or Matthew, who was the tax collector, as we read earlier, he just drops everything and he goes with him. And I'm thinking, why is it just seems so simple. They would just drop everything and go with Jesus? Did he have some kind of halo around his head? Or was he, on the side offering them more money? Of course, none of that. But understanding the context that these men have been told, you aren't good enough. You can't make the cut. Understanding the prominence that a rabbi had in a community like that. And here they have been given an invitation by a rabbi, much less the rabbi. Helps me understand why they left everything. But plus Jesus, he invites them, the elites, the best and the brightest, the summa cum laude students, were going up to the rabbi saying, please let me join your band of brothers. Let me be one of your disciples. And Jesus comes to these nobodies and says, come, follow me. Again, the kind of men he invited, he chose moral failures, outcasts. He chose, for example, Matthew, a despised tax collector who was considered a traitor to his own Jewish people. And in that same group, he chose Simon the Zealot, who would be considered a first-century terrorist who hated the government that Matthew had worked for. And Jesus said, you're both going to follow me. He chose Peter, the coward with a fiery temper. These are just a few of the characters that we know Jesus called. And unlike other rabbis, Jesus had female disciples. Don't think of the 12, that's when we think of the apostles. But he had women who would come and completely countercultural. Women would come and sit at his feet. That was not a place for women to come and learn and be a disciple. That was a place for men, and only certain men. But we know Mary, Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, would sit at Jesus' feet. We know the woman who was the sinful woman who came in and she found Jesus and she wet his feet with her tears and her hair and anointed his feet with perfume. And she sat at his feet. And as the Pharisee on the other side of the room was like, Jesus, how in the world can you do this? Jesus' call and his invitation to discipleship was to all the people the world said, that's not who needs to be following a rabbi. It's completely unheard of. And these were the people that Jesus invited into his love, to receive his love. Martin Luther says this, he says, the love of God is different from all other loves. Because every other love finds something lovely and loves it because of its loveliness. If you're married in this room, my guess is, just as I did, you found a wife or a husband and you found them to be lovely and you fell in love with them. Well, God's love is a little different. He says this, Martin Luther says this, the love of God does not find, but rather creates that which is pleasing to it. I love that statement. Jesus didn't just love these disciples. He didn't just love you and me because we were lovely. His love made us lovely. He came not to find and reward the worthy. He came for the unlikely, the disqualified, the unworthy, and made us worthy, made us lovely. So first and foremost, a disciple is someone who has received the love of God. Connected to that, number two, a disciple of Jesus bears fruit for Jesus. Or your version might say produces fruit. Let's just sit in that. Verse 8, my Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples. Verse 16, you did not choose me, but I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce fruit, and that your fruit should remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. We didn't have time to read through the whole passage, but this whole John 14 through 17, Jesus' final discourse, he is just about to be betrayed by Judas and by the Pharisees. And so he is giving them his final, most important words. And even just before this, in verse 4, he says, abide in me, and I in you. Just as a branch is unable to produce fruit by itself unless it remains in the vine, neither can you unless you remain in me. And Jesus is saying here, the proof that you're a disciple, the evidence that you're a disciple of Jesus, again, is not that you believe all the right things, that you have all the right theology. The evidence, the proof of Jesus is that you bear fruit. What does it mean to bear fruit? Well, bearing fruit is living a life that can't be explained without including Jesus. If I were to hold an apple up right here and I said, where do you think this came from? You would rightly say, from an apple tree. If I were to hold a bunch of grapes up here and I say, where did these grapes come from? You would rightly say, from a grapevine. Well, in the same way, when the evidence of Jesus' presence, we know the person acting is a disciple of Jesus. Recently, even just this past week, I was able to witness a friend of mine who's a youth pastor. At his church, he was wrongly accused of a lot of things. There was a little bit of truth in the things that came out, but I was able to witness him bear fruit and show the love of Jesus in a way as he was being accused, as he was being maliciously attacked by some people in his church, and to see him give the fruit of Jesus, which was what? Forgiveness, owning what he had done, humility, things that our flesh would push back against, but was able to see the fruit of Jesus, and it proved he was a disciple of Jesus. I think of the passage we oftentimes use with kids, sometimes because we want to keep them in order, and that's not the purpose of it, but Galatians 5, where the fruit of the Spirit, things that the Spirit produces in us, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those things are evidence of what it means to be a disciple. The third thing, a disciple of Jesus, from this passage in John 15, a disciple of Jesus obeys Jesus. John 15:10, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. Verse 14, you are my friends if you do what I command you. See, to be Jesus' disciple, you had to be ready to obey him. Follow him. No limitations, no restrictions. He told that rich young ruler, we see in John chapter 3, who had spent his whole life cultivating obedience to the law, who had been the best of the best. He had been one of those guys who made the cut. He had it all together from the outside looking in. He told him that to follow him, he'd have to give up control of his own life. And for him specifically, where he had an idol was in his riches, and he'd have to give up his riches. The rich young ruler, amazing as he was, with all the books of the Bible memorized, wouldn't do it. It's what kept him from being a disciple of Jesus, and the same goes for you and for me. We can't be disciples of Jesus if we don't come with a surrendered life, with open hands and submission to all the things that belong to him, that not holding on to anything else. I think it can be easy in our culture, even our Christian culture, to just focus on the love of God, and we should focus on the love of God. I started with it. God gives us his love before he calls us to obedience. And we should, but I think about our culture, it's easy. We sing a lot of songs about the love of God, and we should. Please don't misunderstand me here. But we don't talk as much. It's harder to talk about a life of surrender, a life of submission, a life of obedience. I was thankful I had nothing to do with the songs we were chosen this morning. We sang about holiness this morning, in addition to singing about a good, good Father. But we don't talk about, I think that we don't talk as much about that. I wonder if we've not emphasized the importance as a disciple of obedience, of surrender, of submission. Luke 6:46, why do you call me Lord and not do the things I say? Very straightforward from Jesus. 1 John 2 says, this is how we know that we know him, if we keep his commands. The one who says, I've come to know him and yet doesn't keep his commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. John goes on, for this is what love for God is, to keep his commands, and his commands are not burdensome. So a disciple of Jesus obeys Jesus. The last thing is a disciple of Jesus is committing to becoming like him. In other words, a disciple of Jesus seeks to imitate him. John 15:12, this is my command, love one another as I have loved you. Jesus is putting himself out there as an example and saying, live like I live. We see this all over the Bible. I could only share just a few of these. 1 John, again, 2:6 says, the one who says he remains in him should walk as he walked. That's the call for us as disciples. In Ephesians, Paul writes, therefore, be imitators of God as dearly loved children and walk in love. And again, Paul gets that right there. We do things because we are dearly loved children. That's what causes us to obey, what causes us to want to imitate Christ. It comes first from a flowing out of a life of a disciple who realizes he has God's love, that he knows God's love for him. He said, as Christ also loved us and gave himself for us. And then Peter writes, for you were called to this, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. This is what it's been known. This is what we want to be known for as a church. A church that lives like Jesus lived, that loved like Jesus loved, that walked as Jesus walked. A church that's committed to becoming like Jesus. You know, the thing about following Jesus is it's not like another hobby in our lives. It's not like, oh, I'm into rock climbing or I'm into fishing and I'm also into Jesus. And it's just another compartmentalized area of your life. It just doesn't work when it's kind of an aside to the main point of your life. In fact, it's actually really hard and difficult to do it that way. And kind of just, it does not yield the life that Jesus has to offer. Following Jesus makes the most sense when it's the whole point of your life. It doesn't mean that you need to quit your job, become a pastor, or start a ministry. No, follow Jesus where you are. Follow Jesus as a teacher, as an architect, as a real estate agent, as a retiree, as a full-time parent. Wherever you are, follow Jesus there. The focal point of your life is discipleship to Jesus. And this is the kind of life that you're invited into, not by me and by our church, but you're invited to this by Jesus himself. That invitation, it's for you. Come and follow me. I'm going to close one more passage, Mark 8:34. I read this earlier. Jesus said, calling the crowd with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There's a word there I think that's really important for us that we grab a hold of. I think it was unique to him in his call to discipleship. Jesus says, anyone. Your version might say, whoever. If anyone would come after me, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Unlike the other rabbis of Jesus' day, who was his invitation to? Anyone. And the same goes to today, that Jesus offers this invitation to you to follow him. Regardless of your background, regardless of what you've done, regardless if you've ever been inside a church building before today, regardless of who you are, Jesus offers this invitation to you and to me. Come, follow me. His invitation is not to know the right things, to be able to answer all the right questions in Sunday school, or to have a mental checklist. His invitation is to be my disciple. Come and follow me. And what does he ask of us? To surrender. It's not easy. I think sometimes we've made this, all you got to do is pray this prayer. Come follow me. Surrender your life to me. My commands are not burden. My yoke is easy. My burden is light, Jesus said. But Jesus' invitation to you is to give all of this up, to repent, to turn from all of this and say, my life is yours. I submit to you. And so maybe this morning you realize, you know what? I've never done this. I've never submitted my life, surrendered my life, and come to God with open hands and saying, my life is yours. Take my life and do with it what you please. I surrender all to you. Maybe you've never done that. And this invitation is for you this morning. You're not coming to me or to one of our pastors and following us. You're coming to Jesus. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity in a moment. If you want to come and speak to one of our pastors to talk more about what it means to follow Jesus, to surrender your life, to share your story, to talk about these things, we would love and be honored to do that here in just a moment. But there are many of you here, you would call yourself disciples of Jesus. You call yourself followers of Jesus, but you're in a place right now where you're saying, I'm not living a surrendered life. I'm not living a life in full submission to him. And I just want to lay some things at the altar. I just want to lay some things right where you are before him and say, Jesus, I want to follow you with all of my heart. I have received your love. I want to bear fruit. I want to obey. I want to be yours. I want to become more like you. And this is what we want to do. So as the music plays here in just a moment, I invite you to come and meet with me here. Let me pray for us. God, I just ask right now that your Holy Spirit would have his way among us. That as we respond to your word, that your Holy Spirit would continue to just work within us and call us to yourself. That we, God, if there are people here that are sensing the invitation to come and follow you, I pray, God, that you would just make that so evident and clear to us. In Jesus' name.